Welcome back to Builders of the Broken Bazaar. I'm your host, Dr. Tabish Zaman. Today's episode is a very special one. We are joined by someone who spent decades challenging how we think about innovation, not just as a tool of market dominance, but as something deeply human, as something that emerges from necessity, from community, and often from margins. He's a pioneer of not only just innovation, inclusive innovation, a scholar who has made us all rethink the systems we teach inside the classroom, and someone whose work continues to shape how we understand resilience and creativity under constraints. Professor John Bessant. John, welcome to the Builders of Broken Bazaar. It's an absolute privilege to have you on.
Oh, I'm delighted to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation, Tabish.
So let's start at the very beginning. What is it that sparked your interest in innovation? And how do you see this right from the beginning?
Wow. Well, first of all, we're going back a long time. I've got quite a lot of grey hair these days. Probably two significant points. The first is once upon a time, I was an engineer. So I was working in the chemical industry and frustrated with the challenge of innovation, making new things happen, new products, and in particular, new processes, which is what I worked on, because we weren't getting it right. We weren't failing drastically, but there was a sense of frustration. It could be so much better. And then I had this golden opportunity. My old university supervisor said, would you like to do a PhD? And you can study it working in a company. So you're a participant observer. So it was wonderful. I had 3 years in a chemical company studying how we innovated whilst we were doing it. So quite reflexive. And it gave me a taste for the subject. It gave me some insights. I realized that actually there was something that we already knew about it, and we've accumulated a lot of knowledge since then. So I guess for me, that was how I got started. It was frustration, very self-interested. But the other event, which is perhaps worth flagging, I spent a lot of my early years working on particularly the microelectronics revolution, but looking at how businesses particularly managed innovation. And that's very often where people start. And then one day when I was working in Imperial College, about 2005, somebody came through my door and said, I have a question for you. I work for Save the Children, the charity. And I'm wondering, we have these challenges around innovation, but we don't know how to manage them. Maybe you've got some frameworks that can help. And I have to be honest, I hadn't really thought that hard about it. I'd bumped into social innovation from time to time. It was transformative because I realized these are big questions in a much more challenging context than even the largest, most complex business probably faces. And these are challenges that matter. These are very often literally life and death issues. So the need for innovation is absolutely central. The need, though, to innovate sensibly, smartly, to actually think through how do we do this is clear. And I'd like to think that along with many other people, we kind of nudged the humanitarian and the development system to think more systematically about how to innovate. The need to innovate's always been there, but maybe we could learn to do it in a smarter way. So those are perhaps the two key moments that got me into the game and brought me to where I am now.
I'm so glad you mentioned about managing innovation, and which is what I have seen that theme coming out of your textbook. And I must say, I'm a huge admirer of that textbook. Now, I can safely say, having read that you are one of the leading voices when it comes to inclusive grassroots innovation. Some of the examples you've given, has that focus been always there, or is it something which has evolved over the years in terms of, if we look at the Silicon Valley type of perspective on innovation? And then I'm so glad you mentioned about Save the Children as well. But has it evolved over the years in your own mindset as you've looked through the examples, looked through the cases?
That's a great question. I guess my definition, if you like, I've spent 50 years refining a long, complex, what is innovation definition down to a simple one-liner. It's creating value from ideas. And of course, that value can be commercial value, but it can also be social value. And I think that's been the really important change in my perspective, certainly over the last 20 or so years. I think there was always an interest in that before and a sort of looking from the sidelines at some dramatic innovations. Many years back, we, I think in the UK generally, were captivated by a guy on a TV program. It was a sort of science and technology program, but he was a classic sort of almost like a cartoon of an inventor, white hair and very, very active. But he had invented a wind-up radio. He'd seen the problems of children and getting education in Africa and the fact that without electricity, you can't have so many things. You can't have light, you can't have radio or communications media. And what a difference just something simple like a radio could make to education. It could change a small part of the world. And so being an inventor, he invented this. He borrowed an idea from the 1920s. The very early telephone exchanges used to have a hand-cranked dynamo which generated the power. So he adapted one of these in his garden shed and built a wind-up radio. I still have one, and it works quite well. It's quite a useful device. But he was on TV because this caught the imagination. Suddenly, this boffin could do something. And I remember thinking at the time, that's really challenging. That's great. I like the sound of that. For me, it was also an interesting story because I tracked it as a case study. And we managed to get him down to Exeter University to speak, and he inspired the students. But what I realized in looking at the case was the idea, the heart is in the right place. It could all do so much, but actually to scale that innovation, to make it have serious impact across the whole continent, that's a different story. And it requires a lot of investment, some tough decisions. Early, there was a charity in South Africa who decided this is a great idea and we'll get disabled people in Cape Town to assemble these things for the rest of Africa. Now, actually, that was a wonderful social move. But the costs of doing so and the difficulties of doing so meant that you really had to make that very hard strategic decision. Do you help disabled people in Cape Town with employment, or do you provide a cheap radio that could diffuse to scale? Because actually you can't do both. It's just not economically possible. It wasn't at the time. And it made me think there's a lot more to social innovation than just simply, oh, wonderful idea, and it makes you feel warm inside because it's making some difference to the world. So I think for me, that's been one of the very important points. And as I say, if you looked at the academic literature on social innovation, or particularly humanitarian innovation, in the early 2000s, there was hardly anything written about it.
I agree.
It didn't mean innovation wasn't happening. It was certainly going on, but people weren't reflecting they weren't thinking about how to organize and manage it. Now we're in a position 20 years on where the post of innovation manager is common in most of the large agencies. There are some amazing innovations that have gone to scale. There are outfits like UNICEF or World Food Programme who have world class. They're actually acknowledged by business magazines as being world-class innovation organizations. So the game has changed in the right direction enormously. And I think that's certainly in my own experience been reflected in the fact that there's a lot we can learn from that context, as well as a lot we can transfer from the more traditional commercial world of innovation.
You've rightly mentioned the time of how post-2000, about what you've done in your textbook, and especially those who want to teach innovation. You have very carefully segregated social innovation or the entrepreneurs themselves who are interested in this kind of work. You've spoken about Veronica Kosa, you've spoken about Muhammad Yunus, and again, you've also spoken about organizations like BT, engaging. You've spoken about B&Q, again, in terms of this space. But it's important to understand or compare it with what traditional world is in terms of these organizations I just mentioned. Am I right in calling it more of a vanity project for some of them, where they look at it, okay, we got to be accepted in the society, so we should do this, or buy more leverage in the society, we do that. But in your own experience, John, if I may ask, how have you seen organizations changing and then shaping your own understanding of what they do about all this?
So that's a really good question. And yes, of course, I think it's important that we are skeptical, maybe not cynical, but skeptical. Yes, business is about business, but nonetheless, doing good business may actually help everyone. It may help your bottom line, but it may also help the world. And So yes, there's undoubtedly been enormous pressure on companies to comply with ESG and CSR and all the various social and increasingly regulatory pressures that force you in a certain direction. If you take something like sustainability, it's smart to do something just to clean up your own business, but it's probably also smart for the planet and so on. So the clever businesses actually recognize, no, this isn't we've got to do this, it's another form of tax or regulation. It's actually, this could be something important for us. A very good example, I worked many years ago with the big Danish company Novo Nordisk. And Novo Nordisk now are very popular because of this Ozempic and all these new semi-glutamide drugs that are changing the obesity crisis. But Novo Nordisk began really working as a diabetes company. And what was fascinating was I got to know their sustainability director, their CSR director quite well. And their whole approach was much more, no, we need to work with our market, our users, and we need to understand them. But actually, if we're really honest, what we want to try and do is eliminate diabetes, destroy our market. That sounds crazy, but actually it isn't. It's actually smart business sense, because in that process, certainly on the journey, you'll probably learn some useful things which you can apply in your business. And if you do make the world a better place because you have miraculously eliminated diabetes, you've probably got several other things you could deploy your capabilities towards. But they were seeing this very much as an investment. It wasn't a cost, it was an investment. And they funded many projects, many programs, which were trying to learn with their market about their marketplace. And I think that's the kind of move which smart organizations do. It's enlightened self-interest, if you go back to Adam Smith almost. And I'm reassured it isn't always cynical companies doing the bare minimum. I think there's a lot, not least we found a great deal in the humanitarian space. A lot of the innovations that we look at are supported, enabled, brought to scale by big organizations who are doing their parts. And if you think about it, if you were UPS, for example, deliveries company, where would you learn about crisis logistics? You know, the kind of thing you'd have to deal with if there were a disaster in, say it, in San Francisco or something. How would you help? Well, actually, a good place to start is being part of emergency response and working on the research and the innovation projects around the humanitarian disasters. So I think there's it's almost a learning laboratory for smart organizations to work in this social innovation space, because they'll learn as well.
Yeah. But then it all starts with intent, because having read innovation and known entrepreneurship, and amongst both of us, we can agree that it's a very human process, human-centric process. It all starts with your passion, your direction, your intent, and your desire where you want to take whether it's a small organization or big organization. But let's try to go back on this when we talk about the narrative of innovation. The dominant narrative of innovation, which is synonymous with, we're talking about disruption, unicorn, Silicon Valley comes into play. But do you agree, or do you think that this model is incomplete, especially when it comes to understanding and looking at where the world is right now, what is happening in and around us, and what these corporations could actually do for the society and what they are not? Do you feel there is an incomplete side to this, or understanding of innovation?
Of course, very incomplete in a number of dimensions. I mean, I'll stay clear of the sort of the politics, but the observation that there are some extremely wealthy people out there who've built fast scaling businesses which have transformed the way we shop, the way we interact with the internet and so on, the usual suspects. And there is certainly a question that says, if you were able to deploy even a proportion of that wealth, the way that Bill Gates has done, I think he's a great example of, if you like, a reinvented version of the 19th or the early 20th century philanthropists who made a lot of money and then did something useful with it. Maybe they wanted a legacy, whatever. But I think there is something there, but I'll leave that bit aside. I think the Silicon Valley approach has done us a bit of a disservice, because it makes it seem so simple. That actually all you do is you have a bright idea, you are very aggressive in your pitching, and you convince enough business investors to throw money at it, you go through your scaling rounds, and there you are. You've changed the world. That works with a certain kind of innovation under certain conditions. It's very dramatic, and those things tend to be the digital innovations that have become such a part of our lives. But it's only a small part of the wider innovation picture. Most innovation doesn't involve that kind of digital platform business. There's many other routes to it. And certainly our work on scaling innovation, not least in the humanitarian and the development sector, what you're really trying to do there is build an ecosystem. This isn't just about money. Money, of course, is hugely important, but it isn't just about money. It's about the complementary assets, the who else and what else do you need to take a proven good idea. This is no longer, I've got an idea, how do I get started? This is, we've piloted, we've launched, we've got success in a particular region or a particular country. Now, how do we make this really bite in terms of impact on the world? And that needs other people and other things, complementary assets, and assembling those into a value network. That's the real skill set. And certainly being able to convince people through pitches is a part of that. But it isn't the simple model we often see sort of played out with Silicon Valley. There's a lot more to it. It's a very political process in the world of the development innovator, because you may have to bring on board governments and local authorities and trade unions and many others to make change happen.
And which is where my question is, which is where I keep asking myself, and most of the work which I do around it, questioning that relationship. And again, I don't want to push you in that direction, but questioning the relationship of how economic growth of any country, whether that is USA or UK or the Eastern world, how closely linked it is to the political system. And again, that has given some autonomy to the organization, the corporations, a bigger say in what we do in the society. But do you think, and I'm so glad you mentioned ecosystem as well, do you think that ecosystem has to take into consideration much more than just the economic profit, much more than the outcome which we see day in, day out? It has to be about society in general, or bringing more people into the conversation?
Yeah, that's a very good question, but a huge question. I guess a couple of observations. I think the first is that innovation doesn't happen at the government level. Governments are not innovators. Political systems are not necessarily. They can be part of the context in which things can happen or things become more difficult to happen. So that's a kind of general framing thing, which means that if we look at innovation policy, what we're really looking for is not trying to pick winners or make strategic investments. That generally doesn't work. It is about funding the knowledge system. It is about creating the possibility. So governments putting investment into science and technology, broadly speaking, does bear fruit. We know this not least from things like the internet, which grew out of huge US government investment. But I think it's more about the government set the context in which things can happen. I think perhaps an extreme version of that, my wife is Russian, and her PhD was trying to answer a deceptively simple question, which is how come both the United States and Russia invested enormous sums in the Cold War into key areas of science and technology. But when the Cold War eventually softened and things changed, the US, so many of the things that we now see as the foundation stones for the global economy came out of that investment, but it didn't happen in Russia. The question which she was trying to address in her thesis was, where was that entrepreneurial spirit? Where were the people able to see connections? Where was the political support for scaling up and all these other things? And I'm not going to distill her 3-year PhD into it, but in a sense, it's all about context and making. But I think for me, back to Joseph Schumpeter and early writers, the entrepreneur is the agent of change. For me, entrepreneurs are the ones who make innovation happen. Peter Drucker has a famous quote, innovation is what entrepreneurs do. And I'd add to that, they do it in different contexts. Yeah. So they can certainly be commercial entrepreneurs. We've got a long record of those, but they can also be social entrepreneurs. Yeah. And I think we perhaps could benefit from going back over time and reminding ourselves, some of the major social changes have happened through the powerful agency of entrepreneurs doing the kind of things that we'd still teach about today in the classroom. So they're not saying, this is important, we have to change the world. They're then applying good business type skills, systematic skills to converting a great idea to something that has impact.
So those who are really at the periphery or trying to enter the space of innovation and entrepreneurship, I'm talking from a scholarly perspective, and there's so much which has been written around entrepreneurship, the outcome of it, and then social entrepreneurship and the outcome of it. You very nicely highlight that in your textbook when you talk about the social value creation and the economic value creation. Now, is it as simple as that in terms of the entrepreneurs? So someone who's starting out on a journey, do they have to make a decision in terms of, okay, the type of value you are creating? You're creating social value, which has got a very clear dimension around it, and you're creating economic value, which has got a very clear dimensions around it as well. Although the majority, we get pushed around towards the economic side, because then you speak about lumpy funding, you speak about other timeline of the social entrepreneurship, and the outcome you get. So do you think it is something which a budding entrepreneur or a scholar or someone who's studying entrepreneurship should be aware of, and that gives clarity to how their journey would look like or what this process looks like?
I think we have to recognize there isn't a universal archetype for an entrepreneur. There's a spectrum, and it comes down to motivation. Why do you want to make this impact on the world? What change do you want to make? And it may be that you want to, your passion fueled. You actually have always wanted to do something which has a social consequence. My touchstone for this is the wonderful story of Dr. Venkataswamy and the Aravind clinics. I know you're familiar. For me, that was one of the things that made me look hard at social innovation. There you have somebody who's been an eye surgeon all his life, and his passion as a silver entrepreneur when he retired was to take this fairly simple operation. You have to be careful. It's a medical procedure. You must make sure things don't get infected, but take a well-known operation and massively reduce the costs. And to the point that where an operation used to cost $300, he needed to get it down to $30. That's a huge challenge, but that was his passion. And he then applied his not inconsiderable personality and intellectual skills to finding a workable answer, with the result that around 15 million people today can see who would otherwise be blind. It's a wonderful story. For me, he's at one end of a spectrum. He's a passion-driven entrepreneur. There might be others. I put Bill Gates there. Bill Gates certainly didn't start off wanting to change the world or cure some of the terrible diseases and so on, but he's increasingly made that, with the foundation, his mission. So he's discovered that later. I think we have to think of that spectrum as being full of many opportunities for entrepreneurial behavior, some of which might be driven by impact through making a lot of money. Although what I've read about entrepreneurship and motivation, money rarely is the thing. Money is often the symbolic, oh, I've achieved something, but it isn't the money itself. There's not so much. I think there is something about the nature of the challenge, which is quite interesting. And indeed, a colleague in Brazil has a wonderful course he teaches at one of the big business schools, mainly for large companies. So he's taking the cream of the crop. These are going to be the future high flyers in global corporations. And it's an MBA course, but what he's trying to do is teach them something around social entrepreneurship. Mm-hmm. And what he basically says is, look, you are very smart people, otherwise your company wouldn't pay you to be here. You probably want to make a difference to the world, don't you? You want to make your life mean something. Okay, well, here's a challenge. See if you'll pick this one up. Take a social issue and somehow develop an entrepreneurial concept and internally sell that. Convince your boss to back it. Change your company from within. It's wonderful. From an educational point of view, it's a great tool. It's project-based learning. It's challenging the smartest MBA to really think, now, this is all about politics and influence. How do I sell this to perhaps a rather cynical boss? But my goodness, if we could leverage the key resources this big corporation has to make a difference. So it's a lovely challenge. But what he's really speaking to is that kind of, I think, motivation I see a lot in students today. They want to make a difference. They don't just want to make a fortune. They don't just want to be YouTube influencers. They want to make an impact and make a difference.
And I'm so glad you spoke about it, because this is a beautiful example. And what the other day I was speaking to a group of audience where, I was discussing the importance of bringing these into mainstream education. So, for example, the cases we ask our students to do, or the assignment or the assessment we ask them to do, it could involve at a general level as to how students are asked to inquire about the social enterprise, the business model of social enterprise, which is what I was wanting to ask you in terms of being more technical. When I asked you about the social value and the economic value, and you bring in the business model right in the center before we get to the value. So could it be a case where we then have business models of social enterprises or even bigger organizations who are operating in a very difficult circumstances and finding new ways to give out aid or establish logistics and support system? Could it work actually? Do you see in your lifetime, could it become, if we speak about it more and more inside a classroom, then it becomes mainstream. We are able to publish papers, we are able to publish case studies, and then we've got a very nice balanced set of materials which students themselves can choose and say, oh, you know what, this works for us really well. We enjoy doing this, and post our graduation we could take it forward.
Yeah, there's a lot in there, but I absolutely agree. I think if we go back a little, I'm old enough to remember pre-business model canvas and all these other things. Essentially, my definition, innovation is creating value from ideas. So let's first of all be clear what that value is going to be. And the outset is it's a proposition, it's a theory. We think it's going to make a difference, but until we test it, we don't know. So all this idea around value proposition is pretty central to the story. But if we're going to realize that proposition, if it looks like it might actually mean something to people in terms of perhaps making their lives better, giving them something to eat when they're starving or giving them shelter or whatever, then how are we going to make that happen? What's the architecture for creating the value that we want to deliver? And that's where it used to be the business case. And I remember early teaching, you taught about the key elements of the business case, which was a thick document. And what Alex Osterwalder and colleagues did brilliantly, I think, was to crowdsource an alternative way of packaging that into a simple, visual, very tractable thing, which never says this is the way and there is no other, but rather this is a tool. And I love the metaphor of the canvas because anyone can paint on it. They happen to have identified a reasonable number. I did a degree in psychology a few years back, and one of the things is our brains are pretty limited in terms of how much we can hold and work. And it's 7 plus or minus 1 usually is the magic number. So they've gone plus or minus 2. They've got 9 things to think about, but it's a pretty robust device for anybody with an idea. Okay, if it's going to happen, it's not just going to happen by accident. And then you're into the elements. What I think's been really interesting, particularly back to your question of the social innovation side, is the number of social versions of that canvas that are now available. Things that we need to think about. And really, it's still assembling the architecture. We don't just say, let's build a house and just throw the materials together. There's a structure to it, and there's a sequence to it, and something we have to pay attention to earlier, and all this sort of thing. So I think if we come back to social innovations, the ecosystem becomes very important because we don't necessarily have the alignment. In a profit-based business, everyone in the company, in theory, wants to get to the same place, make more profit for the company. That's fairly uniting in its sense of mission. That's not true of social innovation. Yeah. So we have to work much more at aligning, identifying who are the key players, getting them on board, working together as a system, the whole greater than the sum of the parts, with emergent properties, to make something happen. And I think that's the kind of thing that today's canvases and today's academic discussion around this increasingly reflects. That, first of all, I don't think it's a solo act. I think big changes, certainly big changes with impact, you have to do it with other people and other things. So who and how? And that kind of what we call value network analysis and value network building, I think is a key skill. And the nice thing is we've now got some pretty rich cases to demonstrate that with.
Yeah. The good news at the moment, quite rightly you said, the whole discussion around the ecosystem, the entrepreneurial ecosystem is out there. And you can see a lot of work being done in that direction. People are speaking about it. But you're right in saying that the economic model is self-organizing. But the social side of it isn't as intuitive. It doesn't come to the entrepreneurs as intuitively as we think it should, which is why I feel our role inside the classroom is very, very important. And our role on the research desk is as important as well, where we should be writing about it more, we should be publishing about it more. I'm not saying we give up on the economic model. Obviously, that is a building block of what we're talking about. But it's a case where we need to highlight these cases a bit more. We need to bring out these stories more, and which students take up, and researchers, budding researchers, they take up on it as well. But moving on, John, if you don't mind. Now, we've spoken a lot about the bigger organization, the bigger ecosystem, and all of that. I want your views really on those entrepreneurs who are really operating in a very, very difficult circumstances. And when I say difficult, I'm not just talking about turbulent context. I'm talking about even in the Western world, where it's hard to get the resources. There's so many bottlenecks, and there's so many blocks, as we call them, or the barriers. How do you think these entrepreneurs should go about, or how they could carry on to innovate or be where they want to be with their products or services or whatever they're looking to achieve?
Wow, it's a huge one. I'm an optimist. I think things have improved. I think it's still, as for any entrepreneur at any time in history, it's still tough. It isn't simply, I've got an idea and it'll all happen. It's going to take passion and energy, a huge amount of grit, of resilience, of being able to cope with things not working. But I think it also is increasingly clear it's a multiplayer game. It is about networks. That I think very, very few innovations are one-person operations. Most things happen through a network, and therefore being digitally connected in the way that what we're doing now, just chatting to each other, even though there's physical distance, that does make a difference. And some of the we do a lot of work coaching teams trying to scale innovations in particular. And we're often talking to people who are not necessarily in the same bit. They may be in a large country and one of them is in one end of it and one somewhere else. It doesn't matter now. So the tyranny of distance and that has begun to sort of change. So I think it's easier than it ever was to build a network. That's one thing. I think the understanding of what it takes to be an entrepreneur trying to make anything happen, whether it's a social or a commercial innovation.
Is it the vision which you're alluding to?
Certainly, I think the individual, it has to start with a vision. You have to see something that you think can be made better in some way, can make a difference. But what I was going to say was, I think now the knowledge base, if you like, I'm in the education world, I think people now have access to much more about how to do it. Whether that's available in the form of a boot camp or an online course. A lovely example I came across fairly recently, the University of Southern New Hampshire isn't particularly well known. It's not like Harvard or MIT, but I think it's doing some wonderful stuff, partly because part of their mission has been distance education, open education. And one of their targets has been the world of the refugee camp. That's a pretty tragic world, but we have to recognize we're talking about small cities. You're talking about populations of hundreds of thousands. They're not just sitting there dependent. They are people, human beings, wanting to do something. And within that, statistically, there are many potential entrepreneurs. What the University of Southern New Hampshire does is offer an online course, which people can take via mobile phones, and the technology supports this, to study being an entrepreneur and to take their ideas forward, and then to find connections with sources of funding and expertise. So there's an example for me of how the knowledge base is now much more available to potential entrepreneurs, even if it still feels quite lonely doing it. And I'd like to think that that's perhaps the education shift that has really begun to make a difference. Certainly now, I think as we discussed a little earlier, in the last 20 years, innovations come center stage in the world of development and humanitarian fields. And that's partly why, because we know not just how to innovate, how to be an entrepreneur, but also how to do it in those kinds of contexts, the things to pay attention to.
So that underlines what you have mentioned very nicely: necessity entrepreneurship, necessity innovation. We are doing a project in Finland at the moment, and we're speaking to a group of refugees who are trying to integrate and embed themselves in the society through the act of the entrepreneurship. They mentioned this when we spoke to them about how necessity, we always talk about necessity is the mother of invention. And for them, they said necessity is everything. It's the mother, the father, the village, the whole system, in terms of what necessity entrepreneurship is. So do you see this going as a more mainstream in how these group of people are actually taking forward their ideas and what it would take them to be successful, and what does success look like for them?
So for me, there's something really quite important from a sort of theoretical, if I can be that point of view. In a sense, what you've just described is being human. Ever since we were living in caves, trying to survive in an incredibly hostile environment, necessity's driven us, and that has driven us, together with our imagination and our ability to work as social animals, to create things that have helped us to survive. So that's a long-standing thing. Sadly, it's still there. There's some tragic necessities, not just in some of those extreme contexts out in Africa or Latin America or somewhere, also back here. I mean, we're not short in the UK of deep social necessity that drives innovation. But it's part of, in some ways, something which came for me very strongly in focus with the pandemic, with COVID. It's what I call crisis-driven innovation. Crisis happens, and crisis is often unexpected, and it's challenging. It's very hard to live in. But essentially, out of there, you're sometimes knocked away from some of the more traditional models to think again. It's a very kind of human thing. How are we going to solve this problem? We've got to do something. We can't just surrender and let it wash over us. And for me, this crisis-driven innovation, which the pandemic brought into all of our lives, suddenly we were all experiencing a crisis, does interesting things for innovation. It helps us sometimes jump the tracks. We open our minds, we explore different things, we become more neuroplastic. Our brains think differently. And that's when I think some really interesting things happen, and where rich possibilities for future impact start to emerge. So sometimes when I try to illustrate this point, that there's a movie or a book originally which made into a movie which I found fascinating when I was a boy. It's basically a plane crash in the middle of the desert. The plane goes down. People survive. Miraculously, the pilot lands them, but they're in the middle of nowhere, hundreds of miles from help. The radio's out. What are you going to do? And that's the starting point. And of course, you're human drama. But there's a serious crisis, because if you don't do anything, you'll all be dead in 3 days. So you have to do something. And it's basically the story of a guy who sits at the back and nobody at first listens to, but it turns out he's an aeroplane designer. And he recognizes that the bits of the plane that still work, there's one engine and a few bits, you could actually glue them together and build an aeroplane out of the ashes. And so the book's called The Flight of the Phoenix rising from the ashes. And it's a wonderful adventure story, because with all the human drama, they build a plane and fly themselves out to safety. It's ingenuity. It's classic reframing. It's so many elements. It might be fiction, but it's got plenty of analogs in practice. And I think that for me is where the necessity entrepreneurship skill set is actually so important. It's what we have as human beings. And I think we can learn from crisis-driven innovation and then say, even to large, well-established organizations, well, how about if, and at least try simulating and playing with what happens if. And what we saw in the pandemic was amazing cooperation in incredibly short timescales to solve the crisis problems as they emerged.
Yeah. So the modern world has obviously seen the pandemic as a blueprint of how a lot of these entrepreneurs have come out. I mean, again, would you have any insight on what it would look like during Cold War, for example, during the World War II or World War I? Any insight on that as to how this would play out then for society and for people in general?
Yeah. Yes, I mean, sadly, wars do this, and it's a very bad thing to happen, but they're a crisis, an extreme thing, and amazing things come out from that. I mean, two examples just come to my mind, opposite ends of the spectrum. One of them is the origin of the word skunk works. We often talk about skunk works in innovation. It's got a very specific origin. It's right back to the Second War. And in 1941, none of the Allies, neither the Americans nor any of the European allies, had a jet aeroplane. And the Germans did. So there's a looming crisis, because by definition, jets, even the early ones, were going to be faster, possibly more maneuverable. If you don't react quickly, what are you going to do? And the Skunk Works was a sort of, oh my God, we have to do something. Very interestingly, they were given license. They were saying, look, just go over there to the other side of the airfield and work. We don't care what rules you break. This is not the normal. This is a classic sort of what we now call a Skunk Works. But you've got to do it within 6 months because that's the timescale. We've got to have a plane flying. And by the way, we haven't even got a jet engine for you. That has to come from Britain by ship. You can only have the engine to experiment with 3 months into the program. It's a wonderful story. I won't tell it all, but basically they got it flying. It flew successfully, it became the basis of the jet trainer that most of the air forces in the world used after the war. But it was a classic Skunk Works. It was not the big engine aircraft manufacturers. This was a classic entrepreneurial, let's search, let's draw unexpected things together. The other end of the spectrum was in, I think it was Hamburg or Berlin, one of the terribly bombed cities in Germany. It was in the Netherlands, but also one of the cities that was bombed heavily. And the guy who invented the kidney machine. Basically, it's a wonderful story again, people dying of renal failure, wanting desperately. Principles of dialysis were beginning to be understood. The potential was there. And he basically built one out of an old refrigerator motor and sausage skins. It's classic, what we call in English Heath Robinson, they're those crazy machines that shouldn't work. But he basically assembled this from a crisis. So two ends of the spectrum, but both driven by the wartime necessity, the wartime constraints. And actually it led to fascinating and world-changing innovations.
Yeah, and it has stood the test of times as well that way, isn't it? But all these examples, it was then and now in the current times. And again, as an expert, when we are talking about these people, especially those building from the margins who have very little, there's no safety net when it comes to the formal support. What would your advice be to them then? So what should they take away of what they should be doing?
Well, it would be very arrogant of me to try and offer them advice given the context. But I guess the lessons I see is believe in yourself. I think the entrepreneur is, first of all, is an ordinary human being. They're not Superman or Superwoman. It's not some special gift that only certain people are endowed with. It's in human nature. It's the gift of our ingenuity and its social connection, because I think it's, as we've said, not a solo act. So I think there's believe in yourself. I think the second thing is now we have quite a few documented examples. Back to your point about cases, we know that this field of frugal innovation, for example, there are plenty of reference points to say, actually, you can do it. The skills that seem important, if I were to try and distill them, back to Dr. Venkataswamy and Aravind, way outside your normal space. Almost by definition, you're not going to find the solution under your nose because you'd have been deploying it. So look, and as he's famously known, one of the things that helped him come up with the Aravind system was looking at how McDonald's made fast food. An eye surgeon in India to say, actually, I could borrow their ideas. But that's pretty much how the Aravind Clinic works. It's classic Henry Ford, learned originally in fast food. So search widely. Don't be afraid to experiment. I think this idea of which has now become the core of agile innovation, but this try it out, try the prototype out. It may not be perfect, but it will work. The terrible happenings in Syria when it was getting so much bomb damage, the white hats, the guys who were going in to rescue, weren't looking for well-built, nice precision-engineered lifting devices. They were taking airbeds, kids' mattresses that they'd float on the swimming pool with, and using those and inflating them to gradually lift up pieces over a big area to release somebody underneath. Experiment with
Yes.
And
I think that's a very important point. I see modern entrepreneurs, and when I say that, a lot of these people are on podcasts, on YouTube videos, and of course on our television channels, where they're talking about treating your enterprise or treating your ideas more as an experimentation, where you give yourself time, give yourself that space within which, rather than tying yourself to the outcome of the project, you are basically looking at it as an experiment, see what comes out of it. And if it goes well, you obviously push on. But if it doesn't, again, you move on, because it's not just about the idea. It's about making sure whether you're able to sustain it or not, whether you're able to see all the positive indicators coming out of it or not. So linking all of this, what you're also talking about very subtly is resilience, isn't it? Resilience, not just as a theory, but resilience for these individuals more as a lived experience, which we see often in these individuals who are working in the margins in difficult circumstances. So what does it mean to you in the context of innovation?
Well, I think resilience is essential. Wherever you are in the innovation system, whether you're a startup entrepreneur or somebody in an established organization, be it public or private sector, we need this ability to see that innovation is going to involve setbacks and unexpected challenges and so on. It's not that simple transition from idea to it all happens smoothly. So we need resilience. I think sometimes we forget how that's an easy word to use. Oh, yes, let's have some resilience. It's hard to develop because you've hit a dead end. All the effort for the last 6 months has been wasted. What are you going to do? You have to kind of start again, going in a different direction. So recognizing resilience is an important skill, one that I think we can develop. And I think it's no coincidence that of the case studies of entrepreneurs, so many of them say, I made a lot of failures before I succeeded, whether it's James Dyson, 5,000 prototypes before that wonderful vacuum cleaner appeared, or Thomas Edison, 10,000 filaments for his light bulb. Resilience is in part of the game. So I think that's going to be a really important thing. For me, there's something also about users. You talked about the idea of agile innovation. You try things out, but you don't try things out randomly. You try things out on the people who are going to use or not use your innovation. And we know that's a good marketing principle. Really understand that your thing has value. But in terms of social innovation, if the thing is going to work and be adopted widely, it's got to make sense in the context of users. So this is absolutely a situation where you can't sit in your white-coated laboratory and dream up something that they over there will need. You've got to get right in there and understand that context and work within that. So I think that whole user innovation, which is, is another big theoretical strand, it's something we still don't always get right. We know user innovation is hugely important, but for me, it isn't just users have good ideas. Users determine whether or not there's full-scale adoption. That actually, if it's not what Everett Rogers calls compatible, then people will reject an idea, however good you might think it is. Getting to the heart of users, which is why sometimes people working at the grassroots are so much closer to users, and actually their solutions may have a better chance of working for a wider user population.
Yeah, cannot agree more with that. I remember it reminds me of what you introduced me to, what we refer to as Museum of Failures. You've got that whole thing there with a wide array of products and services which never worked, despite being backed by big organizations, a lot of funding and whatnot. But yes, in the context of social innovation, context of social entrepreneurship, do we actually need to rethink how universities, how policymakers, how incubators, all of it, how they need to reframe the whole narrative and how they support this kind of innovation for it to become more commercial?
Yeah, I think, yes, partly the challenge is, as we already talked about, the role models we've got are rather skewed towards Silicon Valley and high-tech spin-offs. That tends to be the university's interpretation still of how innovation might happen, how the university could be an engine for innovation. I think finding ways to get closer to the users, whoever those users are. So if we're talking about the development world, the humanitarian world, getting in the context where these things happen and understanding the constraints those contexts bring, as well as the opportunities. So I think we are making progress. I think undoubtedly the world of universities as agents of innovation has shifted in the right direction, but there's still a long way to go.
I agree with that. So again, as we move in towards the university, the policymakers, the incubators, inside the classroom, how can entrepreneurship education from your experience change? Which means it's not just about business model canvas, which can actually prepare students for all this messiness and the real world situation. Can we offer something else to them? Can we offer an alternative for them inside the classroom, for them to really explore this? And what are the ways where we can sort of challenge the mainstream business education? Yeah.
That's a really big question, really good one. First of all, I think what's happening now, and I'm delighted to see this, is we're recognizing this isn't just a subject for business schools or engineering departments. That's where it came back. The history of education in this field, we can trace back. But this is something increasingly being offered to students right across universities. Whatever you're studying, this is a skill set that you're probably going to find useful. And the European Union, in their policy, say, these are life skills now. The ability to work in a complex, uncertain environment. and give yourself some agency. It's an empowering thing. How do I make my ideas have impact? Well, probably if I understood the process of innovation, how to be an entrepreneur, that would help me. Whatever I end up doing, whether I'm a doctor in a hospital or a policeman or whoever, in a sense, that's a good trend. How we then bring that across, it's not a theoretical thing. It never was. My enticement into the world of innovation was I was facing a problem. I was frustrated by a problem. I wanted to understand it better. I didn't want theories unless they helped me make sense of the practice. So I think what's good in many of the schemes I've seen, including the ones we run at Exeter, is this kind of project-based learning. And I've done this even with school kids. Take a challenge in your school. How would your school be more sustainable? Now, you're all living it. You all get this message. Kids are aware of this. Now come up with a project. We've got a process for doing that. We can guide people through the classic entrepreneurial steps, your value proposition, no harm in using a bit of business model canvas, but you're constantly making it real through your project, which eventually you pitch to somebody.
And something which they can relate to, something which they are seeing in front of their eyes.
Which they care about. Yeah. And I mean, in Norway, I had a wonderful project last year, student mental health, which we know is a huge issue. Well, who better, back to user innovation, who better to start thinking, well, what could we do about this? And let's try it. And the nice thing about the Norwegian thing was what they came up with, they then convinced the university authorities to implement into the next stage.
But then it requires a bit of ingenuity and a bit of risk and a bit of bravery on part of the teaching team and the lecturers themselves to say, yes, this can work, and the ability to look through the process and what can come out of it, isn't it? So I've got 3 very, very small questions for you, very, very quick fire, if that's all right. To our listeners, if you could recommend one book anyone would take up trying to understand innovation or what innovation would mean in all contexts.
That's a really difficult question, probably the hardest one you've asked, because so many people have influenced me and so many people write very helpful stuff. I guess if you forced my hand, I'm going to come down to 2. One which changed my life, which was you mentioned you've used our book and you've helpful. Thank you for that. But the person who wrote the book that made such a difference when I began this journey was Chris Freeman, the wonderful economist who founded the Science Policy Research Unit. But Chris wrote a book called The Economics of Industrial Innovation and was really trying to, for laymen, not for economic students, for people like me, make this thing make sense. So that was a book. But the one that I probably choose, because I think it's the piece of the puzzle that we always kind of forget about, is the adoption side. So Everett Rogers was, again, one of these hero professors. His whole life was dedicated to why do people adopt innovation, diffusion of innovations, and reviewed thousands of studies, did his own research, and distilled, I think, still some immensely practical insights, which I think are still relevant. So if I had to choose one that's still relevant, not least in the world of AI, that would be the one. But there are many competitors.
My second question to you is, amongst the thousands of innovation you have seen, you've written and you've discussed, could you give us one grassroots innovation which has been really eye-opening for you and it has really changed you or your perspective of innovation?
Yes, I mean, again, you're forcing my hand from the many, but I think I've already mentioned it several times. I think that the Aravind story just is transformative because it wasn't about anything new. This wasn't some radical new surgical technique and so on. This was starting with the problem, understanding the problem, bringing the insight and wisdom of 40 years doing that work, but saying, now I have to bring it somewhere else. So let's start again. And from a personal point of view, at his age, to start your entrepreneurial career when you're in your 60s, that had a big thing. So for me, that's probably one of the great cases. And if people don't know that one yet, it's certainly worth a look.
Okay. And my final question, John, I promise I won't push you in the corner. It's a very open one. And that is the world we are living right now, the crisis and everything going on around us right now. What gives you the hope in terms of the future of innovation, which can actually solve a few problems?
Well, I'm a natural optimist, and I think some of that has led me to be concerned with innovation because, as I've said several times, I think it's a fundamentally human gift that we all have, and it's what's got us this far. We've survived some pretty serious crises on the planet. We still make a mess of it, but we're sort of there. Right now, I'm obviously, like anybody would be, fascinated by AI and scared by AI. But what I'm seeing, and maybe this is the classic bias of I want to see these things, what I'm seeing in some of the early results is this is not the super intelligence. This is a fascinating new kind of partner with whom we could do something. And you see already I'm personalizing with whom, but it feels to me AI as a serious equal partner can give us so much leverage on some of the huge problems we face. And for me, that's the dream I'd like to see come reality for AI. I understand there may be some very negative views, but I see glimpses of it. I think there's a very interesting study of Procter & Gamble where they looked at 4 different modes and tried to do a controlled experiment. Here's a problem. Let's launch a new product and see whether it succeeds using only a human team, only an AI team, only using AI like we'd use Google as a sort of library, and using AI as a full partner, as if it was a person in the team. And that's the one that was much more effective. And then you see, well, actually looking at some of the medical advances now and some of the other things where AI is the partner. It's not the replacement, it's the partner. So yeah, my optimism is now to a future which hopefully means we can augment ourselves with AI. I hope I'm right.
That's a brilliant closing remark, John. Brilliant. Thank you so much. So with that, we come to a close, and I leave you with this, John. This has been a very, very rich and generous conversation. You've given us so much time. You've given us so much insight.